So I think people got why it was an important story, but it was a delicate story to publish.
Alan Rusbridger there, and you can hear our full conversation by subscribing to the Iain Dale All Talk podcast on Global Player. Coming up in the next hour, it is Tuesday's Cross Question with the Conservative MP for Heywood and Middleton, Chris Clarkson. He's making his debut. Ella Whelan is not making her debut. In fact, I think she rivals Nigel Farage's number of appearances on Question Time on this programme. She is a columnist for Spiked Online. Oliver Kamm, welcome back to him. He's writer for The Times. And Rachael Maskell is Labour MP for York Central. They're here to answer your questions. The way to ask a question is to ring 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And do watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Home Office insists any migrants sent to Rwanda from the UK will be safe. The Home Secretary is in the country's capital, where he's today signed a new asylum treaty. The Supreme Court had ruled the policy was unlawful, but James Cleverly insists the new agreement addresses previous concerns. Armed officers have arrested a 28-year-old man from Merthyr Tydfil after a pregnant woman was stabbed in Aberfan. Schools in the South Wales village were put into lockdown shortly after it happened this morning. Junior doctors have told LBC going back on strike is the outcome they were dreading. The British Medical Associations rejected the latest offer from ministers of 3% on top of around 9% already awarded. They'll walk out in England later this month for 3 days and again for 6 days in January. Dr. Sumi Manirajan from the BMA union has told us they'll be doing so reluctantly.
When we take strike action, as you know, our consultant colleagues and senior doctors step down, cover the wards and ensure patient safety is maintained. So patients will be seen, but the backlog may increase, but that's because the government won't come to the table with a credible offer.
Downing Street says it would look to continue talks if the strikes are called off. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 24 points at 74.88. The pound buys $1.26 and €1.16. LBC weather. Temperatures falling sharply overnight with a low of -9. A frosty start for many tomorrow before a mostly dry day with a high of 10. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 3 minutes past 8. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Coming up on the programme, you're going to be listening to the voices of Rachael Maskell. She is Labour MP for York Central. Oliver Kamm is a columnist for The Times. Ella Whelan is a columnist for Spiked Online. And Chris Clarkson is Conservative MP for Heywood and Middleton. The number to call 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask them a question, or text 84850. And do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, I'm going to combine two questions here. The first one is a text question from Simon in Portsmouth who says, will the Rwanda plan work? But we also have a caller, Billy from Colchester. Hi, Billy.
Hello, Ian, and hello, panel. Well, my question is, would we even need a Rwanda scheme if we just stayed with the free movement of people from the EU? Yeah?
OK. Rachael Maskell, let's come to you first.
Well, the Rwanda scheme is certainly working for the Rwandan government. They've already taken £140 million out of taxpayers' money, and I understand that the Home Secretary has promised another £15 million. And all we have seen is 3 Home Secretaries in the last 20 months go to Rwanda. So it certainly isn't working as far as the Prime Minister is concerned to meet his pledge, but also it deemed by the Supreme Court it's an unworkable policy. And even with the upgrade, as the Home Secretary will see today, it just means more money going out of the UK. And of course, we've got to heed the words of what the Supreme Court said, that it can't work because people's human rights would not be guaranteed.
To be fair, they didn't say that, did they?
That wasn't their exact words, but what they were saying is
what they said was that these schemes are perfectly in order as long as they don't breach people's human rights, and the Rwanda one would. But given this new treaty that James Cleverly signed today, that is designed to get round what the Supreme Court verdict was.
Well, the key point from the Supreme Court is that they couldn't guarantee that Rwanda wouldn't then return asylum seekers into their country of origin.
This treaty actually said.
But there is no guarantee because the Home Secretary has made a provision or an assumption that there will be UK lawyers who will go out and provide advice to people in Rwanda. And of course, he can't guarantee delivery on that. So yet again, we will probably see it wrangled through the courts. And I think the key thing around this, I don't think the government really want this delivered. They want to debate the issue because they want to bring such a focus around the people who are coming, and rightly so, to get on top of the issue of the people smuggling, the people trafficking, which has got to be addressed. But they're failing to address it, so they're using this as an issue to debate rather than an issue to deliver. And that's where Labour would be so different, because we are so focused on ensuring that there is safe routes for people to come to our country, those that should come to our country, but also to go back to countries of origin. But behind all of this, and this is what politicians have been running away from, we have got a situation now where we've got climate crisis, we have got wars across our globe. It is a very unstable global environment at the moment. We have got to reach an international treaty on what we do around displaced people across our planet, and politicians are too scared to tread there. And I trust that when we get a Labour government, we will open up the real discussion which is needed.
Would a Labour government cancel this scheme?
Well, I don't think it's ever going to get off the ground. It hasn't to date.
My question.
So,
because I haven't heard anyone on Labour's front bench say, as soon as we get on day one of a Labour government, we will cancel this evil scheme. If it's so bad, surely you should at least commit to that.
Well, I think day one of a Labour government is going to be packed with things that we're going to be doing, because this country is in a dire situation. But the scheme isn't going to get off the ground. We know that. We know the government aren't serious about it. 20 months, as I say, has passed. So I think what we will want to do is get the right measures in place to ensure that we can address the real challenges of what's facing our globe
Clarkson,
and this issue.
Rachael is right, isn't she? This is all about rhetoric. This is about sending signals to the right wing of the Conservative Party. Please don't defect to Reform UK, because we are really serious about this, even though everyone knows that it's not actually going to happen.
Well, Ian, I assume that wasn't aimed at me, because I definitely won't be moving to Reform UK. Look, if we're talking about rhetoric, to be honest, Rachel's answer was purely that. It was full of sound and fury and signifying precisely nothing. This is what we hear from the Labour Party time and time again. We do it better. We do something different. They never actually quite get down to the detail behind that, unless there's lots and lots of spending involved and lots of borrowing involved. Do I think this can work? Absolutely, I do. I think the Home Secretary was right to go back to Rwanda to try and get those guarantees, because having read the Supreme Court judgment, I absolutely actually agree with what they were saying. They needed some further guarantees. I'm a big supporter of our domestic legislative framework, and I'm a big supporter of the European Convention on Human Rights as well. This isn't just about speaking to the right of the party, it's about speaking to that moderate majority across the country. Rachel will have had the same experience that I did on the doorstep many, many times. People will bring up immigration organically. Now, people aren't delineating irregular migration and legal migration, and until we actually get grips with the illegal migration that's going on, with people abusing the asylum seekers, the asylum system, we can't have a serious discussion about what an optimal level of migration is to meet our needs in this country. I'm not anti-immigration by any stretch of the imagination. I'm the child of an immigrant. I'm very much in favour of having a sensible and fair system, but until we get control of the system that allows people to come here and abuse our system...
But you've had 14 years to get control. You say people are coming here to abuse our system. Well, why hasn't anything been done over the last 14 years to stop them from doing so?
Well, there are a series of exigent circumstances now, and we're not just seeing it in this country. If you look across the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, there are a number of countries now that are dealing with much higher levels of migration. Actually, something that Rachel said there is entirely correct. There are new circumstances, especially the changing climate in sub-Saharan Africa, that are driving people further north. It's changing the way that people live. It's actually reducing the availability of resources. And so desperate people will take desperate measures. We understand that, but there are people willing to exploit them, and we need to stop them.
Well, there are, and I think everyone around this panel would agree that those people need to be stopped. But how is the Rwandan policy a deterrent? Because only 200 people can go at any one time. I think they've said they can handle 500 people in a year. Now, if you are one of 45,000 people who've come over the channel on a small boat, the odds of you being sent to Rwanda are 545,000. I'd take my chances on that, wouldn't you?
Well, as I said, desperate people will do desperate things. I'm not suggesting this is a panacea in of itself, but it is part of a suite of things that we will need.
But it was sold to us as a deterrent, and it clearly isn't.
Well, I wouldn't say that it was sold to us as a deterrent. I think that got sort of rhetoricised in the press because it makes it much...
You just created a new word there.
Well, thank you.
Well done.
Well, there you go. So, well, it's better than Riz, isn't it? I think that was the word of the year. So there you go, rhetoricised copyright, Chris Clarkson. Look, fundamentally, we need to have a suite of measures here because I think, and it goes back to the comment I made earlier, we need to delineate what is illegal or irregular migration versus what is actually the migration that we probably do need in this country. And until we actually have a sensible idea about, sort of what we want in terms of who's coming here and what they're contributing, I don't think we're going to have a sensible grown-up
discussion. Just to go back
to
Billy's question, which, to be fair, Rachel, I don't think you really answered. Would we have needed the Rwanda policy if we still had freedom of movement and if we'd stayed in the EU? Just very quickly on that.
So, to me, yeah, absolutely. Look, the freedom of movement wouldn't have made a difference because, if you look at Italy and Greece...
we would still be in the Dublin Convention, wouldn't we?
Well, Italy and Greece, perfect example. They're dealing with record levels of migration
Rachel?
too.
Well, we've got to look, most people are coming from countries like Afghanistan, where obviously we made a commitment and the government then has reneged on that commitment. So, of course, those people rightfully should be coming for protection, for their safety, for asylum, for sanctuary to the UK. But the government are just not acting on that situation. We know that it's becoming even more challenged as a result of what's happening in Pakistan. Had we stayed in the European Union, of course, we'd be talking about a different landscape because people would be able to have that freedom of movement, and of course that would have helped our economy. We'd be looking at skills and the opportunities there that brought, which really helped us for many years.
Oliver Kamm.
The first question was, will the Rwanda scheme work? And the direct answer is no, it won't, for a reason that you stated in your comments to Chris. Rwanda doesn't remotely have the processing capacity to deal with the backlog that will arise. And I think Yvette Cooper had a nice line that more Home Secretaries have gone to Rwanda under this scheme than asylum seekers up to date. The crucial issue that the Supreme Court has been addressing is that of safety. But regardless of whether the Home Secretary has resolved those queries and those doubts, the scheme will not work. On the wider issue of would the issue arise with if we were part of the European Union and freedom of movement were in place, I regret the fact that we are not part of the European Union any longer, but I don't think it's germane to this issue. The wider point about immigration, and I agree with Chris that voters tend not to delineate the issue of legal migration from the small boats issue. The wider point about immigration is that the government, the Conservative government, and before that the coalition government, have consistently overpromised and underdelivered what they said they would do, which is why net migration is not in the tens of thousands, per year that David Cameron envisaged, but the several hundreds of thousands. I think it would be incumbent upon the government first to explain why that is. There are perfectly good reasons to do with the flow of refugees from Ukraine, from Hong Kong, and to a lesser extent Afghanistan, and the post-COVID surge of overseas students that the higher education system in this country badly needs. And broadly, the government and the Labour Party should explain the benefits of immigration in easing labour shortages. What the government has done instead with the 5-point plan announced yesterday is to make it much more difficult for skilled workers to bring in for British citizens, I should say, to bring in foreign spouses and foreign partners, and for a party that, rhetorically at least, believes in limited government and the sanctity of family life. I think this is a morally monstrous, wicked thing to do. And I trust that the Labour Party, which has been quite quiet on the issue, will scrap this type of thing and explain the benefits of immigration.
Well, I would hope so too, but Keir Starmer is, it seems to me, seeking to outgun the Tories on being strong on immigration at the moment, but that's maybe a subject for another question. Ella?
Well, in relation to the European Union, I mean, the depressing fact is that there was this potential, or at least, the idea around Brexit was that you would have politicians elected in this country being able to make laws in this country democratically or more democratically, and that there would be, a sense of control. That's why it was in the slogan, and how is that going? The depressing part of that quite exciting potential is that this government has completely squandered that potential, is completely squandered any ability to, or any sort of opportunity to try and get serious around the issue of controlling borders. And I'd say the issue of controlling borders rather than the issue of immigration, because I think one of the most frustrating thing for someone who, like me, is a Brexiteer but very liberal on immigration, is that the conversation has managed to, on both sides, from the Labour and Conservatives, kind of boil down to a question of how many are you going to keep out? There are elements of it becoming actually quite reactionary. Over the last few days, I've heard commentators across several sort of press outlets talk about British jobs for British workers and things like that. Slogans that I thought were long gone in the past. But the issue remains that thanks to the Brexit vote, we still have this potential to make our own decisions, with the caveat that there is this issue of judges, of court cases, which, you don't have to be the Conservatives' biggest fan, I certainly am not, to know that that is a problem. So this is, I think a lot of the issues on immigration, particularly with dealing with asylum seekers or false asylum claims, just comes down to sort of really boring, fundamental, basic things like filing properly, like having a centre that's not, lots of people in a hotel, but a proper functioning centre without diphtheria or whatever the bloody disease is in the water tanks, and just doing it properly, rather than thinking that you're going to deport everyone to Rwanda and it'll be, magic the next day and everyone will be happy. It's delusional.
Just to play devil's advocate, what's wrong with British jobs for British workers?
Well, I think a lot of people understand it as a sort of signifier of a trend in politics which has been happening for a very long time with the Labour Party, Gordon Brown, and today, which is the idea that you blame all of society's ills. A government can blame all of its failings and the problems in society, which are real, not being able to see a GP, not being able to get a house, not being able to get a job, on immigrants, on immigration. So if you want to solve all these problems, don't put any bricks in the ground. Just kick some foreigners out. And I think that's I'm being crude, but I think that's what British jobs for British workers signifies to me, which is a sort of keep them out mentality. Which, if you are sort of internationally minded, which I think a lot of Brexiteers are, despite the sort of slurs around them, that doesn't sit right.
Gordon Brown has a lot to answer for, Rachel, with that slogan, doesn't he?
Well, we need to ensure that we've got a labour market for the future, don't we? And the reality is the skills shortage is not just a challenge to the UK, but across the ageing populations across the world. And as a result of that, we need to really invest in skills for the future. Okay. And we certainly know that there is such demand on that workforce that we are going to have to see a level of migration in order to keep our basic functions going, both across business and public services.
OK, Simon, Billy, thank you very much for your questions. More to come in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
21 minutes past 8. We have with us in the studio two MPs, Chris Clarkson, Conservative MP for Heywood and Middleton. I nearly said Ella Whelan there. You're not an MP. You should be an MP.
Not yet.
But would you like to be?
No.
No? I think
I like carping from the sidelines.
I think you'd make a great MP. Rachael Maskell is Labour MP for York Central, Oliver Kamm, writer for The Times, and Ella Whelan from Spiked Online. Right, let's have a text question from Eric in Croydon. Are the junior doctors being irresponsible striking again while waiting lists are so long? Now, junior doctors in England will strike for 9 more days in December and January after rejecting a new pay offer. The BMA said the proposal was worth an extra 3% on average this year, on top of an 8.8% rise already given. Ella Whelan.
Well, yes, I think they're fair enough in doing that. I mean, it comes down to the fundamental question of whether or not their pay is meeting their everyday needs, whether it reflects the work they're doing, inflation, all the rest of it. And I think those arguments still stand. And I think the sort of irresponsible part of Eric's question is interesting to unpick, because I think unfairly there has been a simplifying of the issue of the NHS, particularly from Conservative government, and rhetoric from Conservatives, which says that all of the problems with the NHS, or at least a large part of the problems with the NHS, are caused by strikes. And that's lobbied at them the whole time. And I think that's just a total misunderstanding of the situation the NHS is in and why it's in the situation it's in. Obviously,
on the waiting lists, I mean, there is a point there, isn't it, that they certainly haven't made them better.
No.
You can argue as to how much worse they've made them.
Of course.
They have made them worse.
Of course. I mean, strikes are disruptive. If you strike and you're a bin man, the bins don't get taken out. If you strike and you're a doctor, people don't get their procedures, and that's very serious. And that's why I'm sorry to sound cold-hearted, that's why it's a good leverage tool. I mean, it's an important issue that needs to be addressed. But I've been spending the last few weeks covering the maternity scandal, maternity scandals, and the way in which a lot of women have been ill-served in NHS care. And it's interesting that a lot of that comes down to not funding, not staffing, but cultural issues within the NHS. And I think if we end up seeing the problem with the National Health Service all as simply a discussion around strikes and pay, then we will be completely missing an opportunity to change things fundamentally. So yes, I support the strikers. I think that individual workers need to argue for what they need to argue for, and more power to their elbow. But if we want to have a conversation about irresponsibility and waiting lists in the NHS, I'm afraid we're going to have to move beyond the picket line.
Oliver Kamm, 11.8%. I'm not sure there's any other group in the health service that have been offered that.
No, but junior doctors have a perfect right to withdraw their labour, to make a charge of irresponsibility when they are not the ones responsible for the expansion of waiting lists, I think is a misplaced accusation. And for a long time, the National Health Service has been run on the basis of expanding demands, particularly with an ageing population, and a lack of funds to pay professionals within the health service, both doctors and nurses. Now, an all-graduate profession, and so historical comparisons don't really come into it. And we are in the position of a public taste for, or a public demand for, increased health services, but not the willingness to pay for it. We have a tax ratio that is not particularly exorbitant by international standards, certainly by European standards.
We have the highest tax burden since the Second World War.
But a tax ratio that is significantly less.
What's the difference?
A tax ratio to GDP of 39% in 2022 is significantly less than, say, the Netherlands at 44%. It's a question of whether we're willing to pay for the services that we demand.
But we're spending £1 in £6 of public expenditure on the NHS, £190 billion a year. Now, I can agree with you that if they spent another 100 billion, we could all easily sort of allocate that to various bits of the NHS. But in the end, there are competing pressures on public.
There certainly are competing pressures on public expenditure generally and within the health service. But you're not going to get very far if junior doctors emigrate or don't feel valued or leave the health service altogether.
But if the BMA has accepted a much lower pay rise for consultants, how can they justify not accepting one which is much more junior doctors?
Because of the base effect. They've been underpaid for a long time, and this is true right across the health service.
OK, Chris Clarkson.
So I think there are two separate issues to consider here. So firstly, actually, I have no problem with people engaging in collective bargaining. I think that is a fundamental underpinning of a democratic society. People have the right to withdraw the labour. Similarly, I also supported the minimum service levels legislation. I think that's an important part of it. I think whilst people are engaging in that, essential services need to continue because there are people who will be adversely impacted by the decision to do that, and they actually have a right to receive these essential services. If you've got a hip operation that's been in abeyance for months, sitting there in agony while somebody pickets is not fair. Now, there is a way to engage in collective bargaining without actually adversely impacting people. Now, you've got to look at the fact that this is actually an incredibly high pay settlement that's being asked for. This is another 3% on top of the nearly 9% that's already been offered. I wouldn't go as far as calling it irresponsible. I think it's ill-judged because I think there will come a point where people start to lose their goodwill for junior doctors. I think actually the fundamental issue, though, if we're being really, really serious about this, is that the NHS needs fundamental reform. It's still being run like it's 1948. It's actually receiving record levels of funding. When people keep sort of making these implications that there's actually less money in the NHS, that's simply not true. I mean, that is just, it's factually untrue. The reality is that you can...
In cash terms, you're right, but
yes.
If you take inflation into account, you're not right.
Well, OK, I'll concede that point, but in raw terms of actual money, then that, you can keep throwing money at it. It's not going to improve things because the reality is it's not serving the society that now exists. We're still working on the basis that people went to school at 15 and dropped dead at 65, and that doesn't happen. People live longer, they have more complex needs. We're not focusing on, for example, the social care issues. And, look, everybody had this in their manifesto. I'm the chair of the APPG on local government. The big piece of work we've been doing over nearly 3 years now is a cross-party piece of work on what social care optimally looks like in relation to the health service. Because if you get that right, and I'm not suggesting there's a quick fix, I think it's going to be generational. You get that right, that takes a huge amount of pressure financially off the NHS. But we are going to have to grasp that nettle, regardless of whether it's a Labour government or a Conservative government. We are going to have to sort of cut that emotional heartstring that you can't do anything to the NHS because it's our NHS. We are going to have to say, if we want there to be an NHS in 50 years' time or for our great-grandchildren, we are going to have to fundamentally understand what it does and what it needs to do going forwards.
Rachael.
Well, the government have approached this as a straight transaction over pay, and of course it's so much more than that because junior doctors are very aware that they've got options, that many of their colleagues now are going to places like Australia where they actually get more concentrated training and consolidate their careers in a far better way, and also recognise that you can't keep running and burning continuously, and the workforce is completely burnt out. And as a result of that, they need to know that there is hope and help coming, and that isn't what they've heard from the government. Even with the NHS long-term workforce plan, that will not build the sufficiency which is needed in the service, in the specialisms, which will take so long to build. And therefore the workforce is asking, where is our resilience behind all of this? As well as, of course, recognising the deficit in pay, which is sustained for such a long period of time. We do need to see reform in the NHS because there's got to be new ways of working. And as Vice Chair of the Health Select Committee, we've been out to places like Singapore to have a look at some of the innovation which is being driven in other countries. We want to see that investment here. And I certainly know Wes Streeting is on that tour at the moment to invest in that. But also we need to ensure that we invest in the workforce because they need those opportunities. In Singapore, they will build in research opportunities to advance medicine, not just to pound every single day for long hours until you absolutely have nothing left to give. And that's where our junior doctors are at the moment. So, of course, government need to meet the doctors where they're at. And there's still time to avoid
the junior
these strikes.
Doctors are at 35%.
Well, this is a negotiation. Government have moved a little bit. They've got further to go, clearly. There's weeks to go till Christmas. I say get back around that table.
Because
well, that's for the negotiators to deal with. I'm not speaking on behalf of the BMA, but that's getting around the table, acknowledging the challenges.
Well, they have been around the table for the last few weeks. I think over the last 5 weeks, several times a week. And they've now announced strike action again, which I think a lot of patients who maybe were on the side of the junior doctors are thinking, really, you're going to go on strike the week before Christmas, the week after New Year? Now, that is what I think the caller is, or the texter is saying, that surely has to be described as irresponsible.
The responsibility lies with government because they have got the cards in their hand and they can bring about a movement in this negotiation.
By giving in to 35%?
It's not about giving in, it's about negotiating, and that is a proper grown-up discussion, and clearly they haven't put all their cards on the table yet, and they need to do that urgently.
OK. Right, more of your questions to come. It's 8:31 on LBC News Headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Home Office says any migrants who are sent to Rwanda from the UK as part of a new asylum treaty will be safe. The Supreme Court had ruled the policy was unlawful, but James Cleverly insists the new agreement addresses previous concerns. Armed officers have arrested a 28-year-old man from Merthyr Tydfil after a pregnant woman was stabbed in Aberfan. Nearby schools were put into lockdown. And junior doctors have told LBC going back on strike is the outcome they were dreading. They'll walk out in England for 3 months later this month and again for 6 days in January. LBC weather, temperatures falling sharply overnight, coldest in Scotland with a low of -9.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:34 on LBC. Chris Clarkson, Conservative MP, Ella Whelan from Spiked Online, Oliver Kamm from The Times, and Rachael Maskell, Labour MP. They're with us answering your calls. Billy is in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. Hello, Billy.
Hi, good evening, Ian, and very good evening, panel. I've just got a simple question, really, and that is which party, following an election, is going to spend less on public services?
That's quite a strange question, if you don't mind me saying so. Just explain why you ask it.
Yeah, I'm asking it because, as we know, the lion's share of Jeremy Hunt's £19 billion of headroom has been spent on a tax cut. And, of course, 2 days ago, Keir Starmer said that he wouldn't be turning on the spending taps anytime soon if he won the next election.
OK, Oliver Kamm.
I'm still not sure I answered the question. I think the pressures on public services will be intense, whichever party wins the next election, and let's be clear, it will be Labour. And there needs to be, because we know that the the idea of unfunded tax cuts is extremely irresponsible. No government will do that again, perhaps for another generation. There needs to be some coming together of the tax capability and the public spending. There are ways in which you can cut some taxes and increase others. It would be a good thing to reduce taxes on work and investment and increase taxes on property, and indeed increase taxes on the wealthy. But these are going to be at the margin, and I think the broad outlines of spending on services and on other commitments, notably defence in a particularly dangerous international environment, they're going to be broadly accepted by both parties, and I think Labour will pretty much follow the spending programme that we're already seeing from the government without the irresponsible idea of unfunded tax cuts, and with some, I would hope, more redistributive and egalitarian stress in its tax policy.
Rachael Maskell, when I've had another Rachael sitting in your very seat, Rachel Rees, she has the mantra, well, she's not going to sort of promise anything that she can't fund. And it's true that Labour have made very few spending commitments so far. But if you want to reform all these public services to make them better, surely there has got to be an increase in spending in some departments.
Well, first of all, you've got to look at what comes in before you look at what comes out. And of course, we'll open those books when we get into government. But I think what's key is the opportunities there. As we've already heard about, the redistribution that is really needed. At the moment, the proportion of income which is raised for the Treasury is based on working people's income, as opposed to looking at the wider asset portfolio. And we've really got to tackle that. We've talked about the non-dons, made a commitment to that. I've been calling for a wealth tax, not least the University of Greenwich have come forward and said that you could raise £70 billion if you tax wealth over £3.4 million. So there are new opportunities.
Wealth or income?
Wealth. So there are new opportunities that we've got to look at around redistribution. But then I would take issue with the question, are we talking about spend, which is about the sticking plasters, the amount of money which is wasted in the system, or are we talking about investment, looking at a longer term project around how we're going to ensure that those services can deliver with the greatest efficiencies possible using the new technologies available? And we have got to make that switch into investment. I know, for instance, much of our infrastructure that we depend on today was built in the Victorian age, whether we look at rail or water. We've got to think about where we want to be in the next 50 years and to start making that pathway. Governments have been running from tweet to tweet, not for looking at the next generation.
But what a shame we didn't do that when interest rates were at 0%.
Indeed, that opportunity was there, but we will obviously build more stability behind the economy.
Which I should say was what Ed Balls was saying in 2015 as Shadow Chancellor, Chris Clarkson. Had David Cameron, Theresa May, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak actually borrowed money to invest there, that would have been a sensible thing to do, wouldn't it?
Certainly the last Conservative or / coalition government came into power with record debts and record deficits. So no, I don't think borrowing would have been the right thing to do at that particular time. And I completely appreciate there were record low interest rates. And in an ideal world, yes, if you had a balanced book that was completely flat, yeah, of course you would start looking at where you could actually start targeting that investment. That wasn't the reality. In terms of actually who's going to spend less, I think it's an interesting way of framing, but I don't think it's how I'd frame it. I think, optimally, you can get the idea is try and get the best possible services for the least amount of money. But again, that goes back to the point I was making earlier about the NHS. I mean, who's got the guts to actually sit there and talk about actual reform of public services? And it's a very brave government that does that, because if you say to somebody, right, I'm going to do a root and branch review of X, firstly, it's not very sexy on the doorstep and it's not going to win you any votes. And why? It's going to take years, it's going to be incredibly complicated and people aren't going to stick with you on it. Unfortunately, so the reality of a lot of politics is it's very, very transactional. If you say, I've found this extra sort of £10 billion to throw at service X, that's a lot more exciting to people than I'm going to do a root and branch review over the next two parliaments about how we deliver better social services, universal credit, etc. The appetite for reform is probably there, but the patience for it absolutely isn't. Look, nobody should be talking about a race to the bottom on public services. We should be talking about how we get the most bang for our buck. The less money we take from taxpayers, the better. The more we we can deliver for that money, the better.
OK, Ella?
It's incredibly depressing that this election, whenever it happens next year, is I think, essentially going to be pointless. Oliver said that the Labour Party is looking like it's going to follow the same kind of tact in relation to the economy, in relation to spending, particularly on public services. That's a very depressing prospect. Spending. Sorry. What is the point of a different flag in the poll? I think the intervention from Keir Starmer over the weekend, was it whenever he wrote that sort of article in the Telegraph, saying, hold your horses. I'm not going to do anything exciting. I'm not going to, stir the pot. We're not going to reach into the purse. Don't worry. We're going to keep a steady ship. Was actually, I read it as saying, I'm committing to doing what governments have done for decades now, which is just managing the economy, and actually not managing it very well, but what I mean is not really doing anything to make any kind of real change. Most people understand that public services is part of a wider picture of people's quality of life. And if both parties, as the panelists have exampled just now, are talking about things not really changing, saying I'm hamstrung either from previous governments or because the books aren't quite right at the moment, the message to people is that, forget any sort of improvement in your ability to have fun in your life, forget any improvement in your ability to sort of survive. It's a very, very depressing picture that you paint. And I think actually things could be different because, it's telling that we have endless conversations about tax. I know tax is important. I'm not suggesting that it's not. But there is no party in this upcoming election that is tackling the issue of productivity and growth in any kind of meaningful way. I mean, maybe Truss has ruined that conversation forever.
So
maybe no one wants
growth now than we've ever done before.
Yes, that's not correct. I mean, Labour, I'm quite sceptical of it, but Labour places a great deal of stress on its green prosperity plan as a way of stimulating the economy and of generating productivity gains. I'm a bit sceptical of it. I think if they're serious about it, they should be importing green technology rather than developing a whole industrial strategy around it. But it's not true that they're saying the same thing as the main parties.
The key word in what you've just said there is green, and that's not because I'm some kind of exhaust pipe sucking lunatic, but because there is this sort of disconnect with thinking.
I've just got this image now.
There is this disconnect of the idea that you can have a narrative around net zero or whatever it is, which as much as bleating around LTNs and EULAs, Rishi Sunak still holds to, as well as the Labour Party, which basically is saying to people, you're going to have to narrow your life down to fit a kind of green agenda, whether it's heating your home or driving whatever car and everything, and at the same time saying, but by the way, this is going to make the world a wonderful place. I mean, which one is it?
I think you've hit on something very interesting there. Rachel, it seems to me that Keir Starmer has rightly talked about going for growth, but if the growth doesn't appear, Labour's plans don't add up, do they? Because they are totally reliant on getting a lot more growth than we've had over the last 10 years, getting a lot more growth. I mean, he's actually said it in terms. He wants to be the biggest, have the biggest growth of any G7 country. Now, a noble aspiration, absolutely. But if they don't achieve it, how can they possibly reform public services in the way that we've all been talking about?
Well, what Labour has done is identified the parts of the economy where you've got to make that investment in order to see that growth come about. And we're not talking about growth for growth's sake. This is about looking at addressing those immediate challenges as well, like the climate, like our energy supply, like our creative sector, which has been absolutely decimated. And yet we know when Labour last left government that it brought such great economic return. So making sure that we are making those right investments in the future is really important, because we have got to be able to fund our public services to see that transformation we need to see, which will be really exciting.
It's not got to be made before the growth can possibly happen. But Labour's economic plan is based on the growth happening, and then the investment goes in.
Well, it happens in parallel, because you are ultimately, and this is my belief and where my politics come from, is that unless we go forward and invest, we won't see the pace and the acceleration of growth, an opportunity to then build about the stabilisation of our public services, let alone investing in people's jobs and futures, which a Labour government traditionally does, and it's why we're there, to make sure people have got good quality jobs, good public services and protection, and a society which is working for them.
Well, do stay listening, because our fun question at the end is going to be around pantos. Oh, yes, it is. It's 8:45.
LBC.
In this current atrocities that's been committed.
Has Israel committed war crimes, Ella Whelan?
I don't know that talking about war crimes is the best way to look at this particular war conflict. Has Hamas committed war crimes? I don't know whether you need to classify what looks like the alleged routine and targeted rape and mutilation of women, killing of babies, taking of hostages, all these sort of heinous things that Hamas has done. Would labelling that a war crime make the moral decision for you or not? I would hope not. I would hope that you'd come to your own your own understanding of that without the label of war crimes. And obviously, I think really what you're asking is, how should Israel respond to such an attack and such an existential threat from a Jew-hating death cult? And the answer is, I'm continuously torn. I think that Hamas has to be unequivocally sort of condemned and perhaps exterminated, although on the other hand, that seems impossible. We know that any sort of attack on or attempts at targeted attacks on Hamas mean that civilians die. I don't think anyone thinks that the flattening of Gaza and the sort of wide-scale destruction of the region is going to be good for Palestinians, good for the future of Palestinians, good for the future of the Middle East. But, war war like this doesn't run along simple lines, and there aren't simple answers to it. I think that I bristle at the discussion around the kind of categorization of things as war crimes, or things that fit within a sort of particular set of rules. We've had, I think, a huge amount of scrutiny on Israel's actions, which is right and proper, and it should happen. But there has, I feel that there hasn't been that same kind of disgust and revulsion and opposition to what Hamas has done. And even with the news coming out in the last 24 hours about the extent of the sort of rape of women, and we've just had sort of weeks of people basically saying, did it really happen? If there was a woman lying with her knickers off, does that really mean she was raped? And so I just think that this isn't a war that you can boil down to goodies and baddies, people who follow the rules and people who don't. But there are moral questions to be asked about what you think is, what you think should be opposed. And I think that it's, for me, it's simple. A death cult that wants to exterminate the Jews has to be opposed. How Israel responds to that threat, I wouldn't want to be in there making those decisions because I think it's incredibly complicated. That might sound like a cop-out, but I think probably, honestly, that's how most people feel.
Oliver Kamm.
Yes, that's how I feel. I think that Israel is fighting a just and necessary war. No democratic government could fail to respond with force against atrocities of the order that we've seen in 7 weeks ago, that evoke some of the worst pogroms of modern European history, where I think one can reasonably both sympathise with Israel in what it has to do in countering Hamas and also exercise scrutiny over its tactics. Hamas, by design, ensures that Israel cannot retaliate without killing civilians. It embeds itself in residential areas. It buries its arsenals underneath schools or mosques. It fires its rockets from schoolyards. It ensures that Palestinian civilians are bearing a very, very heavy cost indeed. And the Biden administration, the European Union, the British government, and which will be more important for the longer term, the Labour Party, have all recognised this. Where I think it is incumbent upon allies to press Israel is two things. First, an extension of humanitarian pauses so that all aid gets through, while, of course, interdicting any question of flows of armaments. And second, in a just war, which this is, there must be a just way of fighting it, justice in war as well as justice of war. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect Israel to take military casualties, to risk more military casualties in order to safeguard more Palestinian civilian lives. So things like you have to go into the tunnels rather than flood them. You have to go into the apartment buildings and attack the terrorists directly, risking the booby traps of the type that we saw when ISIS was wiped out in Mosul. But broadly, I think Israel is often its own worst enemy in these respects, but it has a just cause, and its allies should support them.
Rachael.
I mean, Hamas knew on the 7th of October what to expect, and obviously Israel did respond to type, and it was the most horrendous situation which occurred where we saw the massacre of the Jewish people in Israel. But the response also has meant that thousands and thousands of Palestinians who have no form of defence has died as a result of this. And the question comes back to the question of whether or not war crimes has been committed. We need to ensure that evidence is being gathered and that the international courts have that opportunity to investigate that area. But I think we're all searching at this time to say, how do we stop the killing? We see the images and it is so distressing for us, and we're not there. They're not necessarily our family. But I have constituents who it is their family, and I've met with them, and there's a stress that they're feeling day by day. That I've got a constituent who's got 2 children in the line of rockets. He is desperate, absolutely desperate. He's Palestinian. And that's what we want to stop. And I think we had a smidgen of hope when we had that humanitarian pause. But the reality is we're all really longing for that ceasefire. And we need the international community, including the UK government, to step up and call for that ceasefire and work towards that ceasefire. Because it's not just about the ceasefire.
So you disagree with Keir Starmer then?
I voted voted for the SNP motion on a ceasefire, but we need to move beyond that because we need to build the peace, and it's complicated.
But isn't Andrew Neil right when he says, "Look, let's just face reality here. there is no hope of a ceasefire. And sometimes you just have to accept, you have to let events play out, and we can all say the things that make us feel good about ourselves, we can all have a group hug, but in the end, this can only be resolved when Hamas is wiped out.
It's not a ceasefire, it's a surrender. It's a surrender because Hamas has no interest in a ceasefire, has never voiced an interest in a ceasefire. It's not an organisation that understands those terms of sort of agreement. It's a death cult. So if you're calling for a ceasefire, what you're saying is that Israel should stop defending itself and stop killing Hamas.
Chris.
Own that.
So I completely agree with the points that both Ollie and Ella made. Look, fundamentally, if Israel is being asked to stop in a ceasefire, it will only be Israel that stops. Hamas will not. Hamas's objective is to kill as many Jews as possible. And the reality is, in order to do that, they're willing to kill as many innocent Palestinians as possible because they've enmeshed themselves in civilian infrastructure. They are perfectly happy using innocent women, children, babies as human shields to carry out their murderous plan. Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. As an ally and a friend, we have to encourage them to do so in a way that will cause the fewest possible civilian casualties. We have a responsibility to do that. The best way to try and ensure that is with targeted pauses to make sure that aid can get into help civilian population and that they can be moved out of the way of wherever Israel is next going to target Hamas's infrastructure, because that's what they're trying to do. But this sort of fallacy that, Hamas will suddenly go, oh, that's marvellous with a ceasefire, we'll all get round the negotiating table is nonsense. In order to achieve a two-state solution, I think most reasonable people believe that there should be a two-state solution, a free and fair Palestine and a strong and secure Israel.
But Israel doesn't want a two-state solution. Benjamin Netanyahu is on the record as saying that he doesn't want a two-state solution. So when you've got Israel not wanting one, and Hamas certainly wants a one-state solution, and it's not Israel, there is no hope for that now. Why do politicians keep mouthing this?
So, look, that's Benjamin Netanyahu, who is leading one of the most fundamentally right-wing governments.
Well, he is the Prime Minister.
Yes, he is at the moment, but he wasn't recently, and he may not be after this latest debacle, because this was a massive failure of intelligence by the IDF. Let's not kid ourselves, and that was on his watch. It's not for me to talk about what happens in the next Israeli election, but let's not assume that he's always going to be the Prime Minister. And I've spent time in both Israel and the West Bank, and I've spoken to young people, and they have a very different view of this. And it's not a case of, they hate the people on the other side of that fence. They just want to get on with their lives on both sides. But, you'll be hard-pressed to find the average Palestinian civilian who thinks, Hamas are wonderful, they're doing a great job for us. They've run Gaza into the ground.
Shall we lighten the mood with a fun question from Chris in Stubbington? Hi, Chris.
Ian, it's panto season. Which pantomime would the panel want to see Ian or themselves in, and who would they be?
Well, that took a turn. I wasn't thinking I was going to be part of this question. And for anyone who says widow twanky, you'll never be invited back. Ella.
Stole words out of my mouth. I don't know. I could maybe see you as a Robin Hood or something like that, and force you to take on that role. I'd like to be Cinderella, because I never get invited. It's Christmas season, and I never get invited to any of the swanky kind of, the press parties that happen and all the different desks and all the different papers. And maybe it's just because I'm cantankerous that no one ever invites me. But I'd like to go and have someone put a fancy slipper on my foot, on my big size 8 foot. So Cinderella is the one that I'm picking.
Size 8 big?
No. But generally,
try my size 12s. Chris.
I'm going to go with Peter Pan because I'm desperately trying not to grow up. I hit my 40s last year. That's enough for me.
Rachel?
I have been in Cinderella, but I was the dog in Cinderella's dog. So there you go. I was in the Brownies at the time. So there we are. But I think Goldilocks and the Three Bears, because I think we just want to make everything just right.
Oh, nice.
Oliver.
I'm sorry to be so po-faced, but I can't think of a reasonable answer. There's a great tradition of folk tales across Europe. Hans Christian Andersen, the Brothers Grimm, who actually made them up for themselves and attributed them to the peasantry. But panto seems such a quintessential 1970s entertainment with things that could not possibly be screened on terrestrial television now.
Oh, no, it isn't.
I just find that I've never been to one in my adult life, and I hope never to.
Well, I haven't in my adult life, but I do remember in about 1972, when I was 10 years old, going to the Arts Theatre in Cambridge, where I can't remember which one it was, but Cyril Fletcher from That's Life, who probably none of you have ever heard of, but he was the star of the show. and he would call kids up on stage to sit on his knee, and I was one of those kids. It's marked me for life. Thank you very much indeed to Chris Clarkson, to Ella Whelan, to Oliver Kamm and Rachael Maskell. Right, we are going to move on in the next hour, and we're going to talk about one of my favourite subjects, electric cars. Now, the government's decision to push back the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars has sent the electric car market into reverse. For the first time since zero-emission cars went mainstream, the number of registrations of new electric cars fell by 17% last month. Private buyers who thought they were getting ahead of the game with the government plan to ban new cars with internal combustion engines in 2030 are deserting the market. But is it all the government's fault for changing their net zero policy? Is it down to a lack of proper infrastructure? Or is it just that the public don't really think electric cars are very good? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Rwandan government has told LBC it would be prepared to take thousands of asylum seekers. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, insists anyone sent to the country from the UK as part of today's new asylum treaty will be safe. Labour MP Rachael